was realized I was being followed. And eventually we stopped, to go to the path to one of these schools. And it was definitely clear I was being followed. And out stepped the woman from the high-ranking government official. Out she stepped. And she said, I've never been here. I've never seen these schools. I just wanted, I wanted to see if you were genuine, Tooley, if you were really working in these areas. And B, I wanted to see for myself. And it was extraordinary. And she, her eyes were open. She'd never seen this sort of thing going on. And presumably she was sort of converted afterwards to realize that these schools were doing something very special.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with Professor James Tooley. He is a professor of educational entrepreneurship and education policy at the University of Buckingham and the current Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. Professor, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Donald. Thank you.
So, Professor, you've done some very interesting research in terms of low-cost private schools in India. Can you tell our viewers what is happening over there?
Yeah, and it's not just in India. The work has taken me, first of all, in India, then Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Sudan, Somalia, and other parts of the world. So it is an extraordinary phenomenon. And I first discovered this phenomenon. So, I didn't create this phenomenon. I discovered it for the West, as it were, 21 years ago. And it was in Hyderabad in India. And it was, I had a hunch about what I might find, but I was working in elite private schools, and I was an expert on private education, and everyone at that time knew that private education was for the middle classes, the elite, and so on. And I was dissatisfied with this, so that on one of my days off, doing some consultancy for the International Finance Corporation in India, in International Finance Corporation is the private arm of the World Bank, but I was working in India. On one of my days off from that work, I went into the slums of the old city of Hyderabad and found a private school serving the poor, and then another and another, and soon I was connected to a federation of some 500 of these low-cost private schools. And I think this was, one of the first times that I wrote about it almost straight away when I got back. It was one of the first times anyone had written about this phenomenon. And for me, it was quite extraordinary because, 21 years ago, I was very naive about this. And it seemed, I spoke to the parents, mostly Muslim mothers I was talking to in the old city of Hyderabad. Why are you sending your children to private school, which costs money, even if it's a small amount of money to us, it's still money, and it's more substantial to a poor person, obviously. Why are you sending your child to a low-cost private school when the government schools are free? When the government schools, you even get lunch at, meal at lunchtime, you get often free books and so on. And the phrase, or a synonym of the phrase that came up time and time again was, in the government schools, our children are abandoned. And I've seen that so many times in my life. I've seen it there in Hyderabad when I first went to see a government school. I've seen it around the world. Teachers either don't turn up in the government schools, or if they do, they don't teach when they should be. And that is the feature of the low-cost private schools, this ubiquitous phenomenon. It's now, clearly all over the world. That is the feature of these ubiquitous private schools that stands out for parents, the accountability. The teacher doesn't turn up, doesn't teach in the private schools, then eventually they'll be fired. Obviously, there might be some, understanding that things, perhaps need, some work and some attention. But generally, you get fired. In the government school, that doesn't happen, and this is seen with crystal clarity by parents.
So why is this popping up in predominantly poorer countries? Because I can imagine that state schools in the countries like the United States is also struggling. So why is this happening in these poorer countries?
Yeah. So I mean, the answer is I don't know, but I have some, and maybe there's a few things I can say about the richer countries. But on the poorer countries, let's be very clear of the phenomenon, and it's quite remarkable though. So you're hinting at this. It's quite remarkable how the similarities between poor parts of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and the poor parts of sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is slightly different because obviously South Africa is a slightly richer country. So the phenomenon isn't as widespread in South Africa, but still there. I've seen low-cost private schools in South Africa, but not to the same extent. But in all the South Asian places I've described and the sub-Saharan Africa, north of Southern Africa, at least, 75, 80, 85% of children, poor children, are in these private schools. The government schools have been pushed to the boundaries. The largest figure is in Kampala, Uganda, where not my research, other research has found 85% of students in these low-cost private schools. It's ubiquitous. And the research also shows that these schools are better than the government schools, even after controlling for family backgrounds and so on. And it shows that they are affordable to poor parents. So it's an extraordinary phenomenon. And it's scalable. It is at scale. I mean, the estimate is 450,000 of these low-cost private schools in India alone. But it's sustainable because they're in the main, these are run as businesses, small businesses, and without any subsidies. No, forget subsidies for anywhere. So then your question, that was a sort of long way coming to your question. Why is this not happening in the richer countries? And there could be several reasons. But one is it may be happening to a small extent. But the reasons why it's not there in the same extent, one, the regulatory environment is quite severe in places like, different American states and the UK, say. Secondly, of course, the government schools aren't as bad, so it's not quite that you can say in England, it's not exactly that the schools are so bad you've got to vacate them as quickly as possible by any means. Government schools are okay typically in England, perhaps less so in parts of America. But then there are also these sort of what you might call replacements. So in America, you've got charter schools, and they are, in a sense, they could be seen as perhaps crowding out this alternative. I mean, they are in effect quite similar to the low-cost private schools, except they're funded by the government. So they are independent schools, but funded by the government. And they might crowd out this effect. In England, we have free schools, they're called, possibly academies are in a similar way. And it may just be that the government is more successful in our countries of making you think government is indispensable in the way of education. So there are various reasons, but funnily enough, I've just written a book on this. The book is called Really Good Schools. I'm looking around to see if I have a copy to show you. No, the book is called Really Good Schools. And this was actually for an American publisher, where part 3 of the book really is exploring, is any of this stuff that I've talked about in the developing world, is it applicable to America, and by extension, England and so on? And of course, I say it is, and I have started a relatively low-cost private school in the northeast of England, and I'd be very happy to do that down south. I'm now in the south of England, southeast. And so it may just be that there's needed the first entrepreneur to step into this space. In Nigeria, in India, there must have been a first entrepreneur, or at least a series of first entrepreneurs who stepped into the space and showed it was possible. Perhaps that's all you need in America and England at the moment, that first entrepreneur.
But is it also relevant cheaper labor that you find in third world countries, as opposed to perhaps you don't have these low-cost physical schools in countries like the UK and the United States, but you have online schools? So you don't need all those lecturers. It's the online schools that's really taking over. So isn't it cheaper labor that's a factor in countries like Africa, in African countries?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. And cheaper everything in a way. So, it's when we've looked at opening a low-cost private school in the northeast of England, there's no way we could bring it as low as the schools are in say Nigeria or Ghana or Uganda, Kenya, and it's partly the labor cost, but partly every other cost, the rentals, the cost of all the things you need in schools. And so what we were able to do quite easily, not easily, yes, quite simply, was make a private school affordable to a very new market in the northeast of England, but it wasn't the bottom quintile of income. It was actually the median quintile of income and just about the second lowest second lowest quintile. Now, currently, private schools are only affordable by the top quintile, and actually within that, the top decile. So it was bringing it down, whereas in the countries we've described already, it is absolutely affordable by the bottom quintile, and in many cases the bottom decile of income. So everything's more expensive in these places. Now, you're right to mention the online learning. So this is the phenomenon, and it's actually been, it's been emerging since the COVID lockdowns and so on. A lot of people increasingly are dissatisfied in America and in this country, England. They're dissatisfied with what they've seen of the government's provision, the public provision, as they'd call it in America. Parents have seen that the private schools are better at sending work home during the lockdown. They also have been rather concerned about what the work that has come home from government schools, and perhaps been worried about success with critical race theory or whatever, or gender different, trans issues and so on. So so people are turning to some very good online providers and doing this as a homeschooling or as a sort of hybrid homeschooling, where you've got what might be called micro schools, or they are called micro schools in some sense, where some homeschoolers get together and do learning together, partly through online learning. And that is a growing phenomenon. Now, I don't know enough about that to speak authoritatively, but I'm certainly aware it's happening.
Professor, I know you've mentioned accountability that's better in these low-cost private schools. Are there some other metrics that these low-cost private schools also perform better?
Well, the metrics, so in standardized tests, in English and mathematics and so on, private schools, typically the studies show them doing better. And there's a recent study just come out this week, I think, in Comparative Education Review, which looked at, I think it was rural Pakistan, rural India, and two African countries, Uganda and one other. And they had, as it were, 8 data points showing the public-private advantage. And in all but one of them, and that was Pakistan rural for reading a story, everything else in terms of the standardized test scores and so on, the private were better, and they were actually much better. Once you control for family background, which is the key control you need, typically the private schools were a quarter of a standard deviation better in terms of test scores. So, well, that's an amazing achievement. Most interventions in education, you'd be happy if you've got a 0.15 standard deviation increase or even lower. So a quarter of a standard deviation just by virtue of going to a private school, controlling for family background. So this is not the better kids or the better families going into the private schools. This is controlling for that. And in the cases where the schools are not better, that I don't think anyone has ever found them to be worse than the government schools. And the figure from Pakistan rural was actually, there was no significant difference. But everyone finds that the private schools are much cheaper. So in the worst case scenario, much cheaper overall. If you take into account the per capita funding in the state schools, the private schools can often be a third of the cost of the per capita funding in the state's schools. That's the fees to parents, because that's the cost of a private school compared to this state funding of the government schools. So that's a pretty amazing figure, isn't it? These schools are created by local entrepreneurs, typically people who live in the slums, or typically people who live in the poorer areas themselves. They've got a little bit of education themselves. They've created a school there. They've invested in that school, through their families, or small scale loans or whatever, loans from money lenders, sharks, and they have created schools that are a third of the cost of the government schools, and at least as good as the government schools, typically much better, 0.25% deviation. I mean, what a remarkable success story from the poor areas of Lagos, from the poor areas of Accra, Nairobi, and so on. Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. But Professor, who are the teachers in these low-cost private schools? Because I can imagine a person with a university degree would be quite expensive. So is it someone who graduated from high school, but he has a lot of practical experience? Who are the teachers in these schools?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I told you the evidence that I'm interested in is that's in terms of achievement, pupil achievement, and with that, of course, better likely outcomes throughout life. But a fact which is also well known is the teachers in the low-cost private schools are less well qualified, less well certified than the teachers in the government schools. Less experienced, typically younger, much less experienced, but not qualified, and paid less. So you're faced with this conundrum, aren't you? You say, well, okay, we want our teachers to be paid more, we want our teachers to be well trained, well experienced, better qualified, but actually the ones that are in the government schools, they don't get their children to do as well as the teachers are less well qualified, less experienced, and so on, and less well paid. So, the answer to that question is the teachers in the poorer schools, in the schools in the poorer areas, are typically, again, from the poorer areas themselves. They could, and they're ahead of the children they're teaching. So in the primary, elementary schools, the teachers could well have qualified from high school, either grade 10 or grade 12. The teachers are teaching in high school will definitely qualify high school, but maybe have a degree themselves, or maybe a degree from perhaps not a prestigious university or college, or what we call in many parts of the world, following the British tradition, an HND, an HNC, or other sort of diploma or certificate of higher education, not quite at degree level. In fact, they might well be studying for a degree themselves through an open university or part-time courses somewhere. So they are, but they're from the community themselves. There's no social distance. This is a very important concept. Often you will find in the government schools, the teachers, as it were, come in from the posh part of town, or a posher part of town. They come to a poorer part, or they go out to a rural area. So first of all, you have to factor in their time they get there, and they won't sort of leave early in order to get there on time or early. They will very often arrive late because they've had to travel. And then they will sort of, in a way, often they will despise the kids they're working with. I've heard teachers, the government teachers, say, oh, these dirty, smelly kids who swear a lot and use really rude language and have seen too much of the world, yeah, I don't like teaching, I don't like being with them. That sort of attitude is pervasive. It's common. So the social distance is a very important factor. So the kids who are teaching in these schools, the teachers who are teaching the kids in these schools are likely to be very understanding of the situation of the kids themselves. And that presumably helps as well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense. I mean, you can have all the degrees in the world, but it won't teach you passion for teaching. And a local person will have that. And really, teaching is a learning experience. If you have that open relationship with the students, you can teach each other. But so what is the opposition to this? I mean, if this is so doing so well, who is opposing this? Is it from the state? Is a relevant quote here that it's difficult to get a person to understand something if his job depends on him not understanding it. So is the opposition to this from the state?
Yeah, I mean, your surprise, or whether it's you're making a point of it, but that is almost the question I always ask: what's not to like? You've got these schools which are ubiquitous, serving a majority of poor kids in the urban areas and a significant minority of rural kids. You've got these schools where the children do better after controlling for the background variables, that are they're affordable to poor families, that are fair to girls. I haven't mentioned that, but that's also a finding of research. They tend not to discriminate in general against girls, and that are sustainable because they're run as small businesses and already at scale, so scalable. What's not to like? And so then you have to say, well, the opposition comes from governments, yes, and not all governments instantly. Some state governments I've worked with, particularly in Nigeria, and actually the national government in Ghana, actually see this as helping them out. They recognize that if all the kids in the private schools came into the government sector would be completely overwhelmed. It just couldn't cope, and therefore, actually realize that these schools are probably a good thing. That does happen sometimes, but typically it doesn't happen. And it's the international agencies, the NGOs, the international teacher unions, which fits in with your quote you've mentioned just now. They're all against these schools. And why are they against these schools? Well, I guess, if you're in favor of, if you believe the government should do education and you're in favor of government education, then it's a bit of an insult, isn't it? Your poor parents are saying, I don't want your government schools. In the government schools, our children are abandoned. If I've got the choice, if I've got any money at all, I'll send my child to the private schools, a private school. And that must be quite insulting and hurtful to someone who's been working in favor of government education. And so they look for problems with that. And of course, one problem is these schools charge fees. And therefore, well, first of all, you can paint them with a sort of a capitalist brush. You can say, well, they're just exploiting teachers, exploiting parents, and so on. If you've got an anti-capitalist mentality, you can do that, I guess. That doesn't really wash, for the reasons we've already discussed. These schools are better. The teachers work hard, but are not exploited because these are market rates. So that doesn't really wash, but anyway, people will still use it. But they'll also say, and this is, I've heard many times, and I wrote about it in one of my books, The Beautiful Tree, the private schools cannot possibly be pro-poor, because if you charge fees, you're not, you're against the poor, aren't you? And the government schools don't charge fees. And obviously there's something in this. I would like, my work has been about creating opportunities for as many children as possible, my life's work. And obviously there are some who are excluded because they are too poor to afford private schools. But two things about that. One is those families are typically also too poor to afford government schools, because although government schools don't charge fees in the same way, often they will have levies, a building levy, a development levy, or something like that. But in any case, the other costs of going to schools are still there. So you've still got to buy shoes, still got to buy uniform. And typically the government schools are less flexible. If you haven't got shoes or your proper uniform, you'll be excluded, where private schools probably, because they understand the community they're from, will make some sort of tolerance there, but the government schools often won't. So you need shoes, you need uniform, you need books. typically the government schools are further away from the community. The private schools are right in the community. The government schools are maybe some distance away. So you need transport costs to go to the government schools in a way you don't need for the private schools. So we've done research on this, and a typical figure is the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school is 75% of the cost of sending to a low-cost private school. That's a figure I've had from Nigeria and Liberia.
That's incredible.
Yeah, because of all these other costs. The fees are just, well, they're significant. This is still more expensive, but it's not the deciding factor. So back to my 2 points. The first one is, yes, there are some people who are too poor to go to the private schools. They're typically too poor to go to the government schools too, and therefore I want to help them. And so how do we help them? Well, maybe it's through a voucher system, or maybe it's through philanthropy, or it's even looking at ways of reducing the cost even further to make it more and more accessible to more and more children, perhaps through, as technology improves, broadband, Wi-Fi improves, and so on, through technology. So that's the first point. And the second point is, well, no, I think that's the first and the same works together. So they are too poor for some, but we can find other ways of making them more accessible. Yeah. And of course, I always say to the critics of these sectors, well, I want to be with you when you look a poor parent in the eye, this mother who's scrimped and saved to send a child to the private school. I want you to look her in the eye and say, actually, no, that school is not pro-poor. You've got to go to the government school and get your child's education there. Why would you? How would you have the audacity to come into a place when the poor parent, money is precious, and they have made that decision, quite rational decision, as the research shows, quite rational decision to take the child out of the government schools? How would you dare?
But isn't that the problem, that many of these individuals don't have that perspective? They don't have that on the ground perspective, that they really know what's going on.
Yeah, I think there is something in that. I mean, I don't want to be too critical of this, but there is a sense that some development experts fly into the country, go from the airport to a posh part of town to a posh hotel, and then often will be taken by the government department to go and see some poorest, but they're always under tutelage, under the protection, and they never sort of wander themselves. This is the one thing I did well. I mean, I did this well. I just decided to go into these areas on my own, the poorest slums on the planet, and just see what I found. And I think that is very unusual for a researcher. That's very unusual for someone in development. It's also unusual for government. And the one incident happened in Lagos, which happened a few times. So in Lagos, I was giving a talk at a conference in one of these posh hotels on Victoria Island. For those who know Lagos, that's the posh area. And I think I was giving a talk towards the end of the conference. And one of the senior government officials approached me, I think, as the conference was ending, and said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Oh, well, I'm going back to Makoko." It's one of these poor shanty towns in Lagos. I was doing some teacher training or some curriculum work, I can't remember. And he said, "Oh, that's fine." Anyway, I went to there, and as I was coming into the area, because not many cars come in that area, I realized I was being followed. And eventually we stopped, to go to the path to one of these schools. And it was definitely clear I was being followed, and out stepped the woman from the high-ranking government official. Out she stepped, and she said, "I've never been here. I've never seen these schools. I just wanted, I wanted to see if you were genuine, Tooley, if you were really working in these areas, and B, I wanted to see for myself." And it was extraordinary. And she, her eyes were open. She'd never seen this sort of thing going on, and presumably she was sort of converted afterwards to realize that these schools were doing something very special, which she and so many others like her just had not seen for themselves.
That's so fascinating. And well, if we can bring it back to the UK, I've spoken to Peter Hitchens, who said that I believe, okay, Peter Hitchens is a journalist in the UK. He has said that one of the main problems with education in the UK today was the eradication of grammar schools. Okay, can you tell our viewers, a South African mainly audience, what is a grammar school and why was it so terrible that they were eradicated?
Yeah, so I agree with Peter Hitchens to some extent on here, but the first point is they haven't been totally eradicated. It was actually up to the local education authority and then the local authority to decide on this. And I think there are three counties, I think it's three counties in England, which still have grammar schools. One is Buckinghamshire, where I'm based here. I think the second is Kent, and then the third is somewhere near Manchester. I forget is it Salford? I can't remember anyway. But so not totally eradicated. The second thing about them is that they're a good idea, but again, it was a partly state intervention. As the 1944 Education Act brought them in, and it wasn't quite right. Okay, I mean, what you basically do is all children, when there were grammar schools around, and in the areas I work now, at least those three counties, all children at age 11 have to take what they call the 11 plus. At age 11, it's the 11 plus exam, and it's a sort of cognitive ability test, but not a pure IQ test. It's a mixture of cognitive ability and probably some learning from school. You take that, and then if you pass that, then you go to a grammar school, or you went to a grammar school. If you failed it, you went to what was called a secondary modern, or there should have been technical schools, but they never really appeared. And anyone would say, well, are you sure age 11? Are you sure you should have so much depending on one day in school at age 11? And there's that's a sort of state convenience thing, isn't it? But that's not sensible, is it? By any, as educators, we think, well, why 11? Why not 12? Why not, why not flexibility? Allow them to take 11, maybe 12, 13, 14. If on one day, well, give options. You might be ill that day. You might have had trauma that day. Home. Let's make it more flexible. And if you're going to do it, you've got to make it purely cognitive ability. Because if you have too much learning from schools, then you're just judging which kids have gone to the better schools in a way. So there's lots of flaws with the 11 plus, but the principle is not a bad one. The principle that those who've got really great academic abilities should be able to be schooled where their academic abilities are taken into account and really and help. That there should be help promote them in the same way that if you're great at sport or great at music, no one worries that if you go to a school that really pushes your sporting prowess or your musical prowess. Some of our academic, we're too sensitive about that. We're wrongly sensitive about it. It's something that should be pushed if we can. So yes, I don't think it was the right thing to do, but the principle's right. It had flaws. And it was a great source of social mobility. It was a great source of social mobility. Working class boys and girls were able to, go to a great grammar school and then be able to go to Oxford or Cambridge or other great universities on the basis of their academic abilities, not in terms of their wealth. That's been lost. So these schools were replaced by what was called comprehensive schools. In the 1970s largely, and the comprehensive schools are mixed ability, anything goes. Some of them do focus on academic achievements, others don't, and so that source of social mobility has been to some extent lost. So I agree with Peter Hitchens to a certain extent. The principle is right. The actual execution of the principle could have been better. And certainly social mobility is lost as a result.
That's interesting. I don't know if there's any schools that are similar to that in a country like South Africa or any country for that matter. It seems like it's unique to the UK.
No, it's not unique, but it's no, absolutely not. So first of all, Singapore has a system. Now, obviously perhaps copying the British, but nonetheless, Singapore has a very strongly selective system along those lines. And then several other countries have selective systems, but at different ages. So if I haven't looked this up for the interview, but I think Germany has it at age 14, where you're selected and either go a vocational, a technical route or an academic route. France has it, I think, at age 16. Yes, so that there is this, it's not unique, but the 11 plus is unusual, but Singapore also follows it. And my guess is a couple of other places around the sort of the old British, the Commonwealth probably do it as well, but I haven't got those names in my mind.
So, Professor, earlier you mentioned critical race theory. What is your opinion of this new phenomenon? I mean, I've spoken to a few lecturers here in South Africa. They see it's unique. They say it's unique to private schools. It's not happening in public schools. So, what is your opinion of this new phenomenon?
Oh, is that true of South Africa? So it's not true elsewhere. I mean, so it is in the public, the government schools in America and a little bit in England, but you're right, the private schools seem to be embracing it wholeheartedly. I'm not an expert on it, so let's preface my remarks with that, but it goes against really everything I believe about people and education. So I believe in human agency. I believe that we can make a difference in our lives and in our families' lives and our communities' lives by taking hold of our agency. And one of the things that can stop us doing that is if all the time we say we are victims of a system, we are victims of something that is making it impossible for us to be agents. And so that's one criticism. And then the second criticism, there's an unfortunate facts, unfortunate empirical evidence, which sort of undermine the critical race case, as far as I can see, because the critical race case, certainly the bit I know, the case for white privilege. Okay, let's look at that. So white privilege would be part of this case. The unfortunate fact for people who propagate that view, that there's something about white privilege going on in schools against, as it were, non-white. The non-white group, I don't like that phrase, but we're almost forced into it if you say white privilege. The non-white group, and in England we call it the BAME group, the Black, Asian minority ethnic groups, they have differential achievement. And if you look at achievement in schools in England, and my guess is the same phenomenon elsewhere, and instead it's been going back a long way, whites don't come top by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, they are typically second from bottom if you classify them in groups. All the Asians, Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshis, typically do better. Chinese, obviously, do better. Africans tend to do better than the white group. The group that does worse than the white group typically would be African Caribbean students. And that's been going on for years. Now, there's some variation there. But anyway, the crucial point is the white group is nowhere near the top. It's actually at or near the bottom. So that's an inconvenient fact. If there's white privilege as part of your critical race theory critique, surely any white privilege worth its name would make whites come out top or near the top. It doesn't. They come out bottom or near the bottom in terms of educational achievement. And then, if you're an empiricist, if you're interested in evidence, you say, well, okay, one possible explanation could be racism, and the critical race theory could be right, but how is it differentiated that a Black African doesn't get the same dollop of racism as a Black African Caribbean person, or indeed an Indian doesn't get the same racism as a Bangladeshi or a Pakistani? And then you start, well, you as a scientist, as a social scientist, you say, well, are there any other factors? And you find family background is a huge factor. Family, again, I haven't got the exact figures in mind, but there's a recent study by Dr. Tony Sewell on these issues in England. And it's something like only 6% of Indian families are single parent families, whereas I think it's 2/3 of African Caribbean families are single parent families, and everyone else is in the middle. And so I think the critical race theory doesn't almost forbids this sort of discussion, because it says, well, there's only one factor, and it's race. And what that seems to suggest is that I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, it could well exist and could well be one factor. But the evidence seems to suggest culture, family, all these areas are as important or much more important. So I think that's, as I say, I'm not an expert, but that would be the sort of where I think it falls down, this critical race theory.
Yes, it seems like if you look at the data, many of these arguments fall flat. But I think also the problem with critical race theory is, whether it's right or wrong, it's trying to force students how to think. It's deviating from the standard of education, educating someone, providing them with 2 points of view, instead of a critical race theory where it's trying to force a person to think in a certain way.
Yeah, that would seem it is. So therefore, it wouldn't satisfy what a philosopher of education would classify as education. It would be indoctrination or propaganda. That seems likely, yeah, because what we've just had is a sensible discussion about this. That tends not to be part of what's encouraged in a critical race theory environment.
Professor, one last question I want to ask you. There's been a fascinating conversation. One last question I want to ask you is in terms of accreditation for degrees. It's largely sponsored by the state. Do you think, I know a lot of libertarians argue that accreditation should be gotten rid of. Do you think that should happen, that giving accredited degrees is holding us back?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I would guess it's almost universally, or if not universally, a state thing. So the University of Buckingham, where I am, it has the Royal Charter from 1983, which allows it to award degrees. It's obviously a state thing, and other universities in England either have the Royal Charter, or they have degree awarding powers now from what's called the Office for Students. So look, I tend to sort of in this realm of higher education, I'm much less purist than I am about non-higher education, where I've worked all my life, and I've been based in higher education, but I'm just now taking charge of it the last year or so here at the University of Buckingham. And yeah, in principle, it shouldn't be done by the state. It should be done by private bodies, which can have the interests of everyone at heart, and some form of accreditation is likely, because if we're going to the marketplace of ideas, we're going to the marketplace, to want some higher education. Typically we'd want some way of distinguishing University X from University Y. Now, one way, of course, is brand names. So it could be that actually we know that this is a very good brand name, we trust the brand, and therefore actually we don't need accreditation. Just like in the marketplace, I've got a particular brand of laptop that I'm doing this call on, and I've never looked it up, anything about it. I just trust the manufacturer will deliver a good service, and the same with other services one has in the marketplace. So you don't necessarily need accreditation, but then for new providers, it can be quite helpful. And there's definitely a market for an accreditor to come in and, for a new provider, I want some way of being distinguished from University Y. My brand isn't strong enough yet, so can we find an accrediting agency to do it? So there's definitely a market. It should be outside of the state. To me, perhaps it's not the biggest. I'm not going to fight this at the moment. Perhaps this is not the biggest thing on it worrying me.
Do you think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the United States, they have accreditation by states or by state locations. It's not, yes. Isn't that a better way to go to make it more decentralized?
Yeah, but remember, America is big, the United States of America, so some of the states would be the size of countries elsewhere. That's the first thing. Yeah, and actually, I'm willing to concede I don't know fully what goes on there, because you're absolutely right. They are state accreditors. Now, are they actually state as in government, or are they private or semi-private based in that state? Do you know, I did know the answer to this. I don't know it now, but a recent law or custom has emerged in America where you don't have to be accredited by the state you're in. So you can be in by an accrediting agency in the state you're in. So the new University of Austin, you may have heard of it, is in Texas, but it is seeking accreditation from another state in America, and that's a sort of phenomenon that's going on. So yes, I like the idea of flexibility, even if it is state or quasi-state. Yeah, where you can actually go to a competing accreditor. That seems a better system. Yeah.
This is such a fascinating topic, but yeah, Professor, I see our time is running up. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
So let's bring it back to where we started, because that's been my life's work. There's this extraordinary phenomenon of low-cost private education that, in a sense, I discovered for the West, but then I became the champion of it, and I then created some federations, of which one in Nigeria is my proudest achievement, AFED, the Association of Formidable Education Development, with nearly 1 million kids in schools there. I created a couple of chains of these schools, but the phenomenon deserves looking at, and I believe deserves respect. And a lot of those people criticizing it are doing it for strange reasons, and not, I don't think, because they have the interests of poor families, poor children, poor parents at heart. I don't believe they have those interests. If you're a critical of this sector, I don't think you have those interests at heart. So I commend this sector to you and your listeners.
Yeah, no, I really hope this takes off in South Africa. But yeah, to our viewers, you've most certainly enjoyed the content if you've made it this far. So please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.